Welcome everybody to All In Together's Black Women Lead Town Hall. We are so thrilled to have all of you and to have this incredible group of women joining us today to talk about some of the most critical and urgent issues of our time. I'm Lauren Leader. I'm the co-founder and CEO of All In Together, and I'm going to speak very briefly because what I want to hear tonight is what I know all of you want to hear, which is from all the incredible women that will be speaking with us tonight in this most incredibly important time. But I wanted to take just a second to acknowledge our partners at the LBJ Presidential Library, at She the People, and at the 19th News. We are so honored to have their partnership and their friendship for this incredibly important event. It is not the first time that we have worked with She the People or the 19th. They have been incredible partners to us. And now we're thrilled to welcome the LBJ Presidential Library as well. You can follow us on Twitter and tweet this evening at Black Women Lead. We're looking forward to your comments. And we will be taking questions and answers. So if you have a question for any of the speakers at any time, you can type them into the Q&A, into the comments box. And we look forward to hearing your questions. We will be filtering them and sharing them with our moderators. I also wanted to take a minute to thank our sponsors who have stepped up to help support this incredibly important program, Lord Abbott and Merck, and we'll be hearing from one of the leaders from Merck momentarily. These are just two incredible partner companies that have worked with All In Together for many years, helping bring our important content to life, and we're grateful for their support. So why are we here? We're here because it is time to shift the power in America. The mission of All In Together is to ensure that women have equal power, influence, impact, and say in all the most important spheres of power in our society. That they have personal power, that they can fulfill their full potential as humans, that they have professional power, that they have access to any job, any professional opportunity that they so choose, that there are no limits to the height of their careers. And the third is the political. We need women in all levels of power, and the political in this country and in every country is fundamental. You cannot achieve full power in the other two if you do not have political power. So just a word on where we are today, and I know everyone on this call is very conscious of the many issues and challenges facing our nation. But I want to call attention to a few important statistics about Black women particularly. Black women are 12% of the United States workforce, but only 3.8% of the management positions. There are currently no Black women CEOs in the Fortune 500, and only 2 have ever served as CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Black women still face a massive wage gap and make up 18% of the low wage workforce in the United States. You know, when it comes to power in this country, there is no question that women have it. We outvote men and have outvoted men in every election since 1980. And finally, it feels like the American media landscape has finally caught on to the incredible power of Black women in every election, in this coming election and in every election. More Black women are not only registered to vote, but turn out to vote than any other group of Americans. 63% of eligible Black women turned out to vote in the 2016 election. It is time that Black women get their due in the halls of political power. And yet they are still so profoundly underrepresented. Only a tiny percentage, 6% in the House, 1% in the Senate. These numbers have got to change. And at the state legislature level, just 4%. But you don't need to hear from me about this. We have incredible women with us today to talk more about the landscape of what's happening in this country today, and more importantly, where we are going. And so with that, I would like to welcome and introduce my dear friend, Congresswoman Pressley, who needs very little introduction, groundbreaker, game changer, flag bearer for change in her state and across the country. And so with that, Ayanna, I turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Lauren. And probably the most important part of my bio, the one thing as a longtime friend that was not mentioned there is that I am my mother's child. And that is probably the most defining thing about me as a woman, and certainly as a lawmaker, as an activist, and as an agitator. But before I talk a little bit more about my mother and why we're all here, I just want to say how restorative it is to be in virtual community with all of you. I wish we could all physically be together, but at a time of unprecedented hurt in our nation, you are the balm that I needed in this moment. So thank you to 19th News, She the People, and All In Together for convening us in virtual community this evening. We have to continue to do our part to stay physically healthy and to remain distant to keep our community safe. But it's so important that our efforts to organize and to mobilize not wane, that we remain intentional and continue to be connected. Without a doubt, we are living in unprecedented times, navigating a pandemic within a pandemic, the public health epidemic that is the coronavirus, and the epidemic that is the scourge that is police brutality born out of the original sin, and also in the midst of all that, a confluence of economic hurt and other trauma. We are weathering a COVID-19 crisis, which disproportionately has claimed the lives of Black and Latinx communities, and we're in a moment of public reckoning about the original pandemic in this nation, so corrosive, racism. In this moment, it is so critical that we center the humanity and dignity of people, and that we ensure that those closest to the pain are driving and informing the policymaking. Now, you don't have to tell me that Black women are on the front lines of every transformative movement. My mother, Sandy Pressley, may she rest in power, the woman who gave me my roots and my wings, she did not read me bedtime stories of nursery rhymes. She read me the words of Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm, and told me tales of Black struggle and Black liberation, and made sure I knew that the work of the full emancipation of Black folks was a cradle to grave struggle. Black women have been the innovators, the prayer warriors, the justice seekers, the truth tellers, the table shakers, the architects of movements, and the foot soldiers of movements. We've been the nurturers. But I want to just say and hold space for a moment that although our contributions are undeniable, and I'll never give short shrift to the power of Black girl magic, I know a lot more about Black woman work and Black woman excellence, and I know everyone participating on this live in this moment does too. But our value is not only about our vote and about our work, it is about our very existence. And so I just wanted to hold space for that as well. So many of you have been on the front lines and in the trenches of the struggle for justice. We were born into it. So I will get to the point. Invest in Black women, pay Black women, center Black women. To the aspiring anti-racist accomplices tuning in, you posted Black Lives Matter on social media. Thank you for that. And now I'd like to see you post a picture of your board, a rundown of your budget, and a list of Black businesses you frequent. Director Reginald Hudlin reminds us that we can't just fight the power, we must be the power. And so I enlist your partnership in making sure that that happens. In America, we have been precise about the draconian and discriminatory policies and wealth distribution to white landowners since this nation's very inception. So in this moment, I need our anti-racist, justice-centered policy and resource allocations to be just as specific and just as precise. I look forward to the meaningful dialogue that will take place here tonight, the candid and courageous conversations. I thank you for participating in them. We don't need performative allyship. We need partners in dismantling systems of oppression. So I'm going to leave you with a few tangible items responsive to priorities that I've been championing in coalition on the federal level. Call your member of Congress and ask them to sponsor my End Pushout Act to stop the criminalization of Black girls in our schools, strengthening the school to confinement pathway. Call your member of Congress and ask them to sponsor my Ending Qualified Immunity Act that addresses structural barriers to accountability in police murders. Call your member of Congress and ask them to help pass the Saving Our Street Act, introduced by myself and Senator Harris, that is focused on getting real economic support to our smallest local businesses, especially those owned by African Americans and Latinos. And call your member of Congress and make sure that they are elevating the priorities of the Black Maternal Health Caucus under the Congressional Black Caucus so that we can do something about this damning reality that Black women are still 4 times more likely to die in a developed nation from childbirth or in post-birth complications. The work of justice, racial justice and equity, it must center police brutality, but we must also advance economic justice, education justice, and healthcare justice. All of these issues are conflated. There will be unrest in our streets for as long as there is unrest in our lives. Remain intersectional in your organizing, deliberate in your approach, and listen to, trust, and follow Black women.
Thank you, Ayanna. Thank you so much for being with us and for your words. We are inspired. And I came here to listen, and listen and learn I did. So thank you for being with us. I'm so grateful.
Appreciate you. Thank you.
So with that, we're going to welcome our first panel, an incredible group of women, to talk with us about what is happening in corporate America today. There's been a lot written in recent weeks about the efforts on behalf of many major corporations to stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And as Ayanna pointed out, there is a difference between performative allyship and real allyship. I think our speakers today will help us clarify how that is different, how the work that they are doing inside their incredibly important organizations, Nikki Allen at Boeing and Celeste Warren at Merck, are tackling that challenge on behalf of people everywhere. And I'd also like to welcome the amazing Erin Haynes, who's the editor-at-large at the 19th News. If you are not following Erin on social media, you should. She is a critical and important voice for what is happening in America today, and I look forward to hearing from her. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Erin, Nikki, and Celeste.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you to everybody who's tuning in for what I can already tell is going to be an amazing evening. I'm so glad that you're here to spend this Monday evening with us. Congresswoman Pressley, as usual, shook the table, but she has also set the table for what I think is going to be a really robust conversation. And, you know, I think she makes a good point that Black women are always part of the solution when it comes to really perfecting this democracy in so many ways. And that includes in the workplace. And, you know, we know that if a Black woman is on the case, then, you know, the problem is going to be addressed. And in fact, listening to Black women, you know, before there is a problem also can often keep us out of trouble. But we are having a conversation tonight about power. And our goal tonight is to hopefully help you all feel empowered. And to help us do that tonight are two women who are so dynamic and are such a force for good in their respective workplaces. And so I am going to try to stay out of the way as much as possible so that we can hear from them as much as possible about really a situation that so many of us are confronting, dealing with, you know, institutions and systems, including our own workplaces. So with that said, I think I want to start with you, Celeste, and I want to ask you, as noted in the introduction to the program, Black women make up 12% of the workforce, but are only 4% of the managers. And so in your experience, what would you say are the biggest challenges to Black women's advancement at work? And how can companies work to close that gap?
Thanks, Erin. And Lauren, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful, wonderful opportunity. I think from the standpoint of challenges, I used to like to say that when we've all heard the adage of when America has a cold, Black people have pneumonia. And I like to take it a little bit further and say when America has the cold, Black people have pneumonia, but Black women are in the ICU. And so when we have the challenges that we see with our careers and progression, I think it stems from a lot of different things. One, I think there are a lot of assumptions that are made about us as women around our careers, around our professional lives. And when these conversations are taking place with leaders in succession plan discussions, in talent review discussions, and those different forums where they're saying, well, who should get this special assignment or this stretch assignment? There are a lot of assumptions that are being made as opposed to just coming and managers really knowing the Black women who they lead and who they are managing, knowing what their career aspirations are, knowing what it is that their strengths and their areas of development are, and being able to speak intelligently about that in these forums. I think secondly, Black women especially, are branded when we take certain roles. And if we stay in certain roles, staff functions or different chief of staff and different types of roles, we tend to get branded in those roles. And so we have to really make sure that we're navigating our career very, very purposefully. Career navigation sometimes is challenging, especially when you're in a large corporation and you don't understand the whole aspect of the organization. You don't understand the different divisions, the different opportunities that lie ahead in those divisions, understanding the structure that exists in a lot of the organizations. I can remember having a conversation with a young woman a few years back, and she was saying that she wanted to lead a learning organization. She loved learning and development and wanted to do that. And so when I had asked her, well, what are your aspirations from a career perspective? She said, I want to be a vice president. And I said, well, you know, in this organization, that the top person in the learning and development organization is not a vice president. That role doesn't exist in the organization. So being able to make sure that you understand your organization and your structure and that navigation is really, really critical, especially before you go and you're talking to someone. Unless there's active focus on women of color, and especially Black women, in these discussions that leaders are having, we get lost. And so we get lost from the standpoint of, oh, we're talking about people of color, so it tends to be the men of color. And we're talking about women, and it tends to be the white women. And so women of color, especially Black women, we tend to get lost if there's not an intentional focus on us. So having sponsors, having mentors is so, so critical for us in making sure that we have that advocate in the rooms where they're having the dialogue around the advancement and the development of the employees. I think some of the things that need to be done in corporations, they have to be purposeful, they have to be planful, they have to have a multi-dimensional approach. This isn't something that happened overnight, and it isn't something that's going to be fixed overnight, but in order to accelerate our development within organizations, you have to have a multi-dimensional approach. You've got to look at the culture within the organization and really stamp out the biases that exist within the leaders and also within the organization. There are biases that exist. There's cultural norms and political norms that exist that go against some of the attributes that we value as Black women. Some of us we're not bent to be political. In some cultures, in some organizations, you have to know how to play the game. And so being able to understand that is critical in some cultures. But taking a multi-dimensional approach means your talent acquisition processes, your promotion processes, your talent review, your succession planning, all of those processes, you have to take an intentional view and look at what it is showing as far as your women. When you look at succession planning, for example, making sure that you are saying and calling out, well, let me see the women of color. Where are they at? Are they in succession plans for critical roles? And not just those roles that are in staff functions, but P&L roles, operational roles in manufacturing areas, making sure and being intentional about it and calling it out. So it takes all of those things to be able to really get at the acceleration of the advancement of women.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of great points made there. Nikki, I want to come to you because I feel like, giving folks takeaways here coming out of this conversation is so important. And so talk to me about the changes that companies need to make to support Black women at every level of the company, as Celeste was talking about. Absolutely. So I love this question because I'll start with, I think that companies are doing an amazing job hiring Black women or intentionally trying to acquire Black talent. The challenge that I'm seeing is that once that talent is onboarded, there has to be purposeful and intentional development, and more importantly, retention, right? A lot of companies, mine included, many of the companies I'm sure the audience represents today, have these amazing diversity initiatives, right? They partner with HBCUs or other diversity organizations like Women of Color in Technology or National Society of Black Engineers from a technical perspective, right? I'm technical, so I usually lend myself towards those organizations. Those initiatives are amazing. And we spend a lot of time and resources going to strategically identify and acquire talent. Here's where the failure mode happens. We bring that talent on board and then the courting process sort of subsides. And 9 out of 10, that talent is going to be reporting to a manager who probably was not even involved in planning or designing that diversity initiative. And if given the option of voting where the resources that were allocated to the initiative went, whether it was, let's spend, and I'll give an example, let's spend $1 million on R&D for a new product line, or let's spend $1 million on an HBCU partnership to increase diversity hires, some of these managers would not choose this option, right? Some of them would put that money back towards product line development or some other, what they would assume is automatic profit and loss sort of reward, right? They don't see the long-term game of in investing in top talent, especially Black women. So these young people, these women, even, and in some cases it's experienced career hires as well, they're usually reporting to someone who doesn't have an appreciation for how they got there in the first place. And yet that manager is responsible for realizing the outcome that created the need for an initiative in the first place. It's an absolute failure mode. So, and I would say this too, as Black women, all women, but specifically Black women, we are intelligent and we are capable. And we absolutely know when someone is not going to invest in us. It does not take us having, you know, a degree in biomedical engineering or having 20 years of professional experience. You know very early on whether or not someone is going to invest in you. And so we make a decision at that point. And that decision is fight or flight. So you either decide that you are going to acknowledge that you are going at this on your own, and you put your own networks together, you identify your own stretch assignments, you make sure that you get your own career development, and you go on your own, solicit and find sponsors and advocates, because you know that you're not going to have that direct investment from your direct leadership. And then there are some who choose to flight. And I would say they vote, and they vote with their feet because they go find another opportunity because it hasn't worked out. And so we have to be mindful of that. And I think the first step is acknowledge it. A lot of times we want to turn a blind eye or say attrition's due to other things or they weren't the right fit, but we really have to unpack why are people leaving, and specifically why do Black women tend to leave at a higher rate when it comes to transition to management roles than any other demographic. We have to acknowledge that. And once we do that, I think there are 5 really important things that, and this is for the audience, if you are a manager of a Black woman, or if you are a Black woman who is demanding more and holding your management accountable, here are 5 things that I think are extremely important that you can do today. The first, as a manager, you have got to ensure that you get that individual exposure to the broader leadership team. So many times I've seen Black women brought on teams and they are sort of buried in their peer group. They do all of the work behind the scenes and it gets rolled up into a package that someone else gets the privilege of either presenting to the senior leadership team, or it gets disseminated in a way that she's essentially erased from the good work that was done. You have to make sure they get exposure and get that visibility. The second thing, help identify stretch assignments to help them grow and help them build credibility across the enterprise. There are several times that I will take someone in my group, specifically Black women, and give them a big stretch assignment that 9 out of 10, I know that they are going to fail at. And that is okay. I'm okay with that.
because they will learn the most when they are given that opportunity, and they will grow the most. So help them identify those stretch opportunities. Do not leave it up to them on their own. The third thing, make sure that their voices are heard. One of the best practices I use in every meeting that I have is when we are discussing a topic, at the end of that topic, I go around the room to make sure everybody has weighed in. Because there are some people who aren't as extroverted or like to jump in or tag along to every single, conversation or comment. And then there are others who consume the room with a monologue, right? So we have to make sure there's balance. You have to be tuned into that as a manager and make sure you include every single person on your team to add input and ensure their voice is heard. The fourth thing, spend time with them. Learn about their career aspirations. Celeste, you talked about that, right? You have to make sure you understand what is it that they want to do, both short-term and long-term. Talk through with them, hey, maybe this isn't the right opportunity, or your aspiration doesn't match up with the structure we have here. Can we think about how we can still help you close the gap or meet that objective? But you won't find that out if the only time you have a conversation with them is in a staff meeting or mid-year or end-of-year performance review. Get to know them as individuals. They are more than just employees, they are people. And then I'll say the fifth thing, and honestly, this is the most important because this is something I had to demand early in my career. You have got to give people meaningful feedback. If you are on this call and every performance evaluation or interaction you have had with your manager, they tell you you've done a fantastic job and walk away, you ought to question yourself. That is not okay. It is not okay. You have to demand real feedback. What am I doing well that I need to continue doing because it is going to benefit me? And what do I need to consider doing differently? We are all works in progress. If we rest our laurels on where we're at today, you will never grow, right? And so those are the 5 things that I think, personally, I practice, but I think are fundamental to helping Black women succeed in corporate America.
Yeah, those are really some really great tips that I think, frankly, can work in a lot of workplaces. So thank you for sharing those. I want to ask you guys one more we're going to take this lightning round because we want to try to get to as many audience questions as we can because you guys are submitting some really great questions and we want to have a chance to get to a couple of those. And this is really just kind of around this national reckoning on race that we're having right now, right? And how these companies are responding. I mean, more companies are making statements and donating money to advocacy groups during the current protest movement than ever before. What do you think has changed? And what responsibility do companies have to act on racial justice issues? Celeste, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think a lot has changed over the last few years. One thing that I'd like to say is that the corporations, the employees, there's been this awakening. And there's been, for a number of different reasons, we're becoming more socially conscious. I think it's due to the changing demographics of the workforce. We see the next generation of leaders coming in, the millennial generation, Generation Z. They're much more socially conscious than previous generations. And so there's not just a ask, but a demand that corporations understand the role that they play from the standpoint of social activism. This generation is much more diverse than any of the previous generations. And so you talk about the intersectionality of the various different dimensions of diversity. It's there, and they're speaking up. People are just not just sort of sitting back and just saying, you know what, I had to deal with this a long time ago. I've had to deal with it a long time. I'm just tired and I'm not really going to do anything. It is very, very different now. You go back to 2012, 2013, 2014 with Trayvon Martin and Eric Gardner and Michael Brown. There were protests out in the streets, but they were primarily our people protesting, primarily. You fast forward now to 2020, we are seeing protests as a result of what happened in Minneapolis and Louisville and, fill in the blank. We're seeing a different, it's just very, very different from the standpoint of the protesters. They're diverse. You see white people, brown-skinned people, Black people, Asian, all different types of dimensions of diversity that are out there protesting across the globe London, Japan, Iraq. It's just all over the place. Europe. They're all protesting because, around humanity. And it's just a point of where it's not just us talking, it's everyone talking. And I think that is very powerful. Another thing too is, let's put our money where our mouth is. Investors are not just looking at the financial performance of a company these days. They're also looking at beyond that financial performance, because we all know that any company is one tweet away from their stock dropping to the floor. We've seen it with the advent of iPhones and everybody videotaping everything. We saw it with various different companies and some of the things that have happened, and how prevalent social media and how powerful it is. And so our investors are asking questions beyond your financial performance. They're asking questions about, where does your company stand around diversity and inclusion? What's the culture that's in the company? What are your corporate responsibility initiatives around sustainability, et cetera? I've been involved in a lot of calls, and it's just gotten more and more. It's increased over the last year. Investor calls where investors are calling and asking questions, and they're pulling me in as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer of the company and asking me questions around what we're doing. And so it becomes really, really important that companies, if you want to make sure that you're doing what you can to create and maintain that competitive advantage, you have to be looking holistically at these things. And as much as organizations and agencies need your money, and they do, agencies like the National Urban League, the NAACP, all different organizations, all in together, as much as they need your money, they also want a commitment of your time and your resources and your education and what you can bring to the table to help them thrive. We think about global supplier diversity and all of those entrepreneurs, those Black women-owned companies and those minority company-owned companies and those women-owned companies and that are partnering and doing business with large corporations. We have a responsibility for really making sure that we're doing that. So we want to make sure that we're not just throwing money, but we're throwing our talent and our other resources as well to help around economic inclusion. That's what companies and corporations can do. And the reason why is you got to look beyond your financials and make sure that you understand that shareholders want to make sure that your company, your reputation, your brand is solid just as much as your financials are.
Great, Celeste. Nikki, I want to take this last one to you, and I want to ask Nancy Harris asks this question from the audience. How do we ensure that Black women leaders get that access to the leadership development and that sponsorship that is so critical?
Yeah, so I love this question. Thank you for that, Nancy. I think it's too simple. You have to speak up. You have to speak up. And it's back to my point earlier. You know when you're not being invested in. You absolutely know. When you get that feeling, you have to speak up. A lot of organizations, mine included, Celeste runs the organization at Merck, has organizations that are focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion. They have pipelines and resources of people and also hotlines if you don't feel comfortable talking to someone personally, where you can bring up these issues, right? Hey, I feel like I am not getting the development that I deserve as a member of this team. You can go to your HR function. There are other places you can speak up as well. But I would say this, it's not just upon us as Black women to speak up. If you are an ally and you consider yourself an ally and you are not Black, it is imperative that you speak up. So you have to make sure when you're in those conversations where talent reviews are happening or mentor programs are being stood up and people are being identified for opportunities, that you speak up, that you say, hey, this person here has not been given this opportunity and I think they would be fantastic or benefit from it. Because it's not enough. We make up, and we saw the numbers earlier, Black women make up such a small demographic in many enterprises today. So to put all the burden on us to go find those mentors, to go seek out those opportunities, the emotional tax is high. It's already high because you come to work as a Black woman every day.
Right.
And then on top of that, I got to go find, you know, my own development plan and my own mentor and my own sponsorship and advocacy. It is a lot. And
It's
it can
draining.
wear you down, right? And so you have to, if you consider yourself an ally and you are not a woman of color, it is even more imperative that you are speaking up, because it will take an entire ecosystem for the systemic biases that hold a lot of us back to change. So we need the allyship. You have to speak up. And I'll just say that, Erin.
Well, I can't think of a better note to end on, Nikki. I really appreciate that message to speak up. And I hope that that is something that the Black women on this call are going to do, and that the allies for those Black women on this call are going to do going forward. Because, you know, we have been saying so much in this coronavirus pandemic that, you know, we're all in this together. And I think that it's an open question about whether we are all in this together around the issue of how we move forward around race in America in this moment. But we do have an opportunity to make a different choice. And, you know, that only happens if we are truly all in this together. So I want to thank Celeste. I want to thank Nikki so much for your insights and for really just a very candid look at what companies need to do to move forward and help Black women in the workplace to not have to deal with systemic racism where they work, in addition to every other aspect of their life. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. And a huge thanks to Erin for so expertly moderating this incredibly important conversation, which of course there is nowhere near enough time to get into every detail. It is a lifetime of conversation. But maybe one of the special outcomes, the important outcomes of this moment, is that people are having these conversations in new ways. Overdue, but welcome. So thank you all so much. And with that, we're going to shift to the second part of our conversation. At the beginning, I spoke about the incredible importance of women having power in every sphere, in the personal, the professional, and the political. That women have power where all decisions are being made about their lives. Our next speakers know this reality better than anyone I can think of. We are so blessed and lucky to have these amazing women with us today. First, I'd like to introduce Amy Allison, the founder and CEO of She the People. And I said at the top that She the People has been a wonderful friend of ours at All In Together. It is a privilege to work with them and to work with Amy, who is a tireless fighter for the power of Black women in politics. She has convened an incredible group of women from across America to fight for that power. Second, my dear friend and amazing collaborator, Alana Odoms-Herbert, who is the CEO of the ACLU in Louisiana. And there is something incredibly important about what Alana is doing today, and that is the incredible challenge that she is tackling, which is that Louisiana today has the highest per capita incarceration in the world. She has been fighting since she took on that job and long before for the voiceless and for those who deserve to have a fight fought for them. So we are blessed to have her today. My friend and the amazing, incredible, indomitable Tish James from my state, the state of New York, the first and only Black woman Attorney General in the state of New York, the only Black woman Attorney General in the United States today. Tish has been fighting many fights on behalf of New Yorkers, on behalf of all Americans. I believe that she might be having a little trouble getting on the video. I hope we will see her in a few minutes, but I know we will hear her. And I know I cannot wait to hear what she has to say. And then our wonderful new friend, Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rosenthal, who is Congresswoman from the great state of Delaware, also the only Black woman elected statewide in the state of Delaware. She is also on Vice President Biden's team, looking for the next vice president and possibly one day president of the United States. And her role is so essential in that and in so many conversations happening in Washington today. So with that, I'm going to sit back and listen to these brilliant women and hand it over to you, Amy.
Thanks so much, Lauren. And welcome to our panelists. I think first I'll say what an honor it is to have a conversation in this moment about the power of Black women's leadership. It's no surprise to most of you that Black women have, from the founding of this country till now, been activists in articulating how to expand the franchise and make sure that voting rights and citizen rights and a politics of justice, racial, gender, and economic justice is available for all Americans. And as more and more Black women have stood up and stood forward into public office, into this present moment, the role of our elected leaders and of those who are leading the drive, is particularly our racial justice, becomes more and more central. It's worth noting, as She the People is a national network of women of color that includes both on-the-ground organizers especially in battleground states and advocates, people who are pushing for a broad-based agenda of justice. And they're also helping to support and promote Black and brown women's leadership across the country. So our goal is to transform democracy. And I want to start by talking about what the possibility is for that in this moment. In the last week, we've seen, and especially we've seen in towns and in large cities, protests, not only calling for accountability for the murder of George Floyd, but also for larger calls for the end of racism and white supremacy and all of that. Let me start with you, Congresswoman. What's the role of Black women leadership in this moment, elected leadership?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I thank you to all of the partners and also to the presenters. And I thank you, Amy, for the work that you do. This is a pivotal moment in our country's history. And I think I want to start off with where Nikki left off about speaking up. I think, as you mentioned, historically, we have spoken up. And I think the reason why this moment is so powerful is because we are unapologetically speaking up, and we are basically back to Shirley Chisholm, who's one of my idols, or saying, we will bring a folding chair, but we are going to be at the table. And I think last night, I don't know how many of you saw, the most amazing moment for me was watching CNN and to see the mayors that matter, to see 4 Black women mayors, Bowser, Bottoms, Breed, and Lightfoot, that to me, the reason why it was so special is because they were demonstrating what we already know, that we are qualified, that we are practical and pragmatic and problem solvers. They demonstrated also a sisterhood. That was really powerful. I wasn't sure what their interactions were with each other, which is one of the reasons why I got on this call and why I was excited about being a part of this, is because I need sisterhood. I value sisterhood. And so I think in this present moment, as Ayanna Pressley, who is to me like the heart and soul, she is my sister, she so eloquently talked about all of the different roles that we play in just our being. And now, if we want to transform this country, this is the time to recognize the leadership of Black women. We won't be taken for granted. And now all of a sudden people are calling me that never called me before. People who didn't return my calls now are calling. And so I also want to recognize and thank all of those individuals who are out there on the front lines and are peacefully protesting, looking for symbolism as well as substance. I want to thank them as well. So this is the moment. This is the moment.
This is the moment. And we have to remember, historically, there hasn't been a lot of focus on the political power of Black women, not in a presidential cycle, not in the context of politics in America. And yet Black women as voters and as advocates have been so critical. I want to ask you, Alana, about the role, your role specifically around civil rights and voting rights, what we saw happen in in Georgia really has caused a lot of concern around Black women and other communities being able to have regular access to voting and any barriers. I mean, what role do Black women have in making it so that in 2020 and beyond that our democracy is healthy and that everyone has equal access to voting?
Thank you, Amy. That's a wonderful question. And I want to just say thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And thank you so much, Congresswoman Blunt Rochester, for making that really authentic call and saying that you, even in your all of your esteem and all of what you've accomplished, that you truly want sisterhood and need sisterhood. I was so excited to be among these incredible women. And I thanked Lauren, and I just said to her, I would like to sit at your foot proverbially and learn as much as I possibly can. And honestly, that has been the way that I have learned, by sitting at the foot of ancestors and women who have been doing this work for far longer than I have. And so what I want to say about the work of the ACLU, and in particular the work of the ACLU in Louisiana, is that we are the nation's guardians of liberty and justice. But in the South, I don't believe you do that work well unless it is refracted through the lens of race and gender. So racial and gender justice is the focus of the ACLU of Louisiana as we seek to protect the civil rights and constitutional rights of all Louisianians. And I want to say a word about protest as well. I think it's really important for folks to understand that dissent is in fact patriotic. It is in fact the most fundamental of our fundamental civil rights: the right to raise our voice, the right to resist, and the right to call out inequality and structural inequality in the ways that we have been doing. And I say this quote often, and my team and friends know that James Baldwin said that I love America more than any other country in this world. And it is precisely for that reason that I insist on critiquing her perpetually. And I want to call the names of our ancestors and women, Black women, who have sought to bend the arc of justice more squarely, bend the arc of the universe more squarely toward justice. And those women are women like Ida B. Wells, who brought her pen and brought a harsh critique to lynching. And now we know that modern day lynching is exactly what we are fighting against. Women like Dorothy Heights, women like Coretta Scott King, Audre Lorde, and Alice Walker, Gwendolyn Brooks, and Harriet Tubman, all of these women putting themselves in fact in harm's way, not just symbolically, not just with a pen, not just with their words, but their physical bodies. And just knowing that that is the sacrifice that Black women have been willing to make for our people and for this country since the beginning of time. And so what is the role of Black women in this pivotal point of uprising in our nation? We are in fact the matriarchs of the movement. It is on our backs that this country was built, and it will be on our backs that this country is saved. And I really believe that. And when I listen to Sister Pressley, and I listen to her call the names of our ancestors, and I listen to her describe structural inequality in the ways that she does, and tell us that it pervades every aspect of our society. We must go to the root causes. We must go to our legal system, our criminal legal system, which is based purely on inequity of race and wealth. We must go to voting and the fundamental right to vote, and how that is being robbed from us because of false narratives, but that are all centered around race and racial injustice. We have to go to our education systems, which we know should be designed to be liberatory and to provide opportunity for people, but yet they are designed to, in fact, hold our children back and ensure that they will not be able to reach the levels of height and success that they deserve. All of these are effects of structural inequality. But let us also go back to the cause. We must go back to the cause, and we can't forget that. And we have to think about ways that we can use litigation, legislation, and community activism and engagement to continue as women in our modern society to continue to bend this arc of the moral universe more closely toward justice.
So when I hear you talk, I hear the passion and also moral authority that it comes from being in a long line of those who are advocating for democracy and justice. Congresswoman, when we hear Alana call out the names of our essentially our godmothers and those who have come before us, you did as well with Shirley Chisholm. Talk about the movements that's happening in the street. For you, what is the way that you are thinking about, and other fellow Black women in Congress and elected, are you thinking about translating or connecting deeply with the calls that you're hearing from the sustained protests that have been, we've seen in the last few weeks, with the work that you're doing every day?
Mhm. Well, you know, it's interesting because as you were asking that question, I also was hearkening back on the past couple of weeks and months of COVID-19. And it has really been, you know, through the leadership of many women like Karen Bass, who is now the head of the Congressional Black Caucus, and my mentor, Barbara Lee, who has been a champion, you know, on the battlefield since Shirley Chisholm, who she just sent me a photo of her with Shirley Chisholm, you know, at a conference just 2 days ago. And I would say the reason why I look at it through the prism of COVID-19 is because basically that just put a magnifying glass on everything we already knew. I mean, health disparities. And so we, as members of the CBC, people like Robin Kelly from Illinois, who is actually leading the Health Brain Trust for the CBC, has focused specifically on making sure that the testing is done in the communities that are most affected instead of just sort of a scattershot. I think everything that Alana was saying about really the legislation, the appropriation of dollars, these things need to be focused and they need to start dealing with some of the root causes. I guess COVID is just so heavily on my heart and my mind because it's sort of like, as Ayanna said, it's like a pandemic on top of the pandemic of racism. And so we actually have an agenda. This last week, you might have seen that we released the Justice and Policing Act of 2020 that deals specifically with things like chokeholds, that deals with the fact that people should not be immune from lawsuits just because you are a police officer. It's about accountability, transparency, training, but even, you know, in my own state, we're having conversations about body cameras. Do we have, thank God somebody else had a camera, and all these other cameras that's one of the big differences that we see now, is that we don't even have to rely on what the police said, but we actually have these things in front of us. So I think, you know, as a woman, a Black woman right now, it's really important also to look at who is in the leadership positions in the House of Representatives. I mean, we have now have Eddie Bernice Johnson, who is heading up, you know, space, aerospace technology, science committee. You got Maxine Waters, who is now heading up the banking committee. And so and Nydia Velasquez, who, when this PPP program for loans started coming out for small businesses, we saw that the money was, again, not going to the people who needed it most. And we had to, like, intentionally carve out spaces for that. And so I think what you see is that now we're at the table. Now we can actually say, we want to see the dollars go here. We want to make sure, even in my own state, we weren't collecting data on COVID-19 properly by race. I said, okay, I see how old people are. I see where they're located, but what race are they? Even something as basic as that are things that we are just practically saying, things have to change, things have to be different. This was before George Floyd passed. And I think, again, I keep going back to this inflection point for us as a country, because as someone said on the call, I have never seen so many, when I turn on Netflix, I didn't know there were that many Black movies. When I logged on to Amazon, I didn't know there were that many Black books. Like, all of a sudden, people are starting to see something. And even companies, you know, I had a company will come to me. I had a company last week, they were talking about, the fact that I'm the first woman to represent, I'm not just the first Black woman, I'm the first woman to represent the state of Delaware in Congress, and the first Black person to represent Delaware in Congress. And we only have one congressperson. And, you know, I'll get these requests to do speeches to the Black Network or to the Women's Network. And my response was, right after I speak to your CEO and see where their heart, their head, their pocketbook, their practices are, then we can have a conversation with the Black Network.
Yeah, yeah.
I just wanted to let you know that Tish is here with us. We can't see her, but she is here on the phone. So I just wanted to make sure we don't miss hearing from the amazing Tish James, because it's hard to tell.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. And so much of what the spirit of what you're saying, Congresswoman, is about not accepting on face value only words, that this may be a moment for us to articulate and see real our vision.
Yes.
I mean, Attorney General Tish James, I'm so glad you're joining the conversation. I think we began talking about and acknowledging, the power of young people who are organizing a clear demand, not only for accountability in George Floyd's murder, but also the system that allows police killing of unarmed Black people, and that has happened over and over again. In fact, happened twice, high-profile cases in the last week. I suppose I should ask you, how do you relate, and how are you responding to the clear calls that we're having? I mean, we're talking about the role of Black women and what's unique and special about Black women's leadership at this moment.
So first, we've got to say our name, Breonna Taylor.
Yes.
We've got to stand up and recognize that there's a cry for justice, and change is now being heard all across this nation, and I would even argue around the globe. Allow me to apologize. My Zoom is malfunctioned, but my voice will not be denied even by Zoom. And so all of these young people, and they're marching right by my house. I'm blocks away from the Barclays Arena, which has become the community space, the community forum. And they are stirred by their passions. They're fueled by their convictions. They're Black, they're white, they're Latino, they're Asian. These are individuals fighting back against institutional racism in every form. And as the Attorney General of the state of New York, I will defend their right to protest, and I will guard it vigilantly. And so with each march, they're marching with their feet, they're praying with their feet. They're going to light the spark that ignites the fires of change in this country, because there's really something fundamentally different about this movement, this uprising. And individuals need to say, I've heard some of my neighbors say, well, Tish, how long is it going to take? They've been marching for 14 days, come on. And I have to remind everyone that this is a teaching moment. The civil rights struggle, the Montgomery boycott lasted almost a year.
That's right.
And so let them march until we have change. Let them march until we have fundamental accountability and transparency. Let them march until we have, again, in Congress, the money that goes to these municipalities and these police departments is tied to an incentive that they reform. Let them march until we disclose their disciplinary record. Let them march until we have inspector generals all across this nation. Let them march, because I want to thank the Congress member, because we have the attorney generals, the Democratic attorney generals, led by the Black caucus of the attorney generals in this nation. And we now have 5 Democratic Black AGs. We included and lobbied Congress. And what we're asking for is that if justice won't do its job, allow attorney generals to step up and engage in investigations of pattern and practices.
Yes.
I, in New York, have that authority under my governor, and I'm investigating the accounts of the last few days and police activities. In fact, I'm holding a public hearing on Wednesday. But I'm warmed by all of the individuals, and I also know that I think individuals recognize the power of Black vote, and particularly Black women, and that's why they want to silence us. And that's why they're coming up and speaking about reforms in the name of voter fraud, even though we know that voter fraud is virtually non-existent. And so no matter how many obstacles they put in our way, just be reminded of our ancestors and those who had it much worse and who didn't have any Black elected officials in place. They were responsible for change. If they can do it, we can too. We just got to hold on and just remember that this too shall pass. And once again, we will be on the other side of the mountain. And I just wanted to say the power of Black women. We've saved our democracy before. We're going to save it again. We're the most reliable base in the Democratic Party, and our voices must be heard, and they will be heard And that's why it's an honor and a privilege to be on this panel, even if I'm on the phone.
Well, and so beautiful. Thank you so much for that. There's so much in that that I would love to unpack. First of all, if we talk about the ways that Black women can show leadership, that it's not the same old, this isn't Black, correct me if I'm wrong, this is not Black women for Black women. I didn't hear anything in this conversation about that. This is about translating what's happening, that's a multiracial movement, into actual policy practices and ultimately a budget and political will conversation, which is so powerful. And so thank you, Tish James, for bringing that to us. I want to talk about Black Women Vote. I know, Alana, we talked about what needs to happen. So let me just, Black women are the highest vote turnout of any race and gender.
That's right.
That if Black women turn out, we have the capacity and the ability to powerfully decide elections, both on the local and on the federal level. Black women and women of color are often targeted for voter suppression. I want to understand how it is that we can be fully heard. In terms of organizing, we don't just organize Black women, and we're organizing across race. Tell me more about that, Alana, and what your assessment is right now of what it looks like this year and going forward.
Absolutely. So I just want to start out by letting you know that the Urban Institute did a study that said that you would be more likely struck by lightning than you would be to see voter fraud happening in our system. And so I want to start out by really striking a chord of breaking down the myths that kind of allow these narratives to go on. And really what we know is that the narrative of voter fraud really allows a movement, a conspiratorial movement, to suppress Black votes and Black female votes in particular. And so it is really the practice of some folks on the right. Their entire campaign strategy is merely centered on voter suppression. And every strategy and tactic that they employ is aimed at that goal. And so I think we have to beat that back, that myth, that narrative, wherever we find it. And I also think we have to know that there were 3 waves of voter suppression. The first wave looked like traditional discriminatory poll taxes and literacy tests that kept us shackled and really said, because of your race, you cannot exercise your fundamental right of the franchise. This second wave of voter suppression really took place after Shelby County. And that case really gutted the second, the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 in particular, and Section 5, which was the pre-clearance clause that really said, listen, states that have had historic and documented issues with discrimination in voting, you must come to the federal government before you change your laws. That was stricken down in the Shelby County case in 2013. And what we saw after that was states immediately working to implement voter ID laws, restriction laws, limiting the right to absentee ballots, all kinds of practices that really looked and felt very much like that first wave, but had these new elements that were really the federal government empowering states that had this history of discrimination to go right back and do it again. Louisiana was one of them. South Carolina was one of them. North Carolina was one of them. Georgia was one of them. And thank God for Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight, because that is the work that needs to happen all across this country. The third wave of voter suppression really looks and sounds in this fraud narrative that is really being pushed out by Republicans, and particularly President Trump, and that says that we've got to curtail the right to vote because we're too afraid of what's going to happen, who's going to come out and vote. And we have to understand that each of these waves, although they've happened in different times in our history, are all centered around the same ideas, and we've got to fight strong against that.
Well, what's so interesting is that, voting rights is not a partisan issue.
No.
Voting rights is not a partisan issue, and it shouldn't be. This is in a functioning democracy. I also want to say, part of it is intentional efforts to limit Black women's access to the polls where it would make a difference. But part of it is, and this is beyond party, is speaking in the kind of language and the policies that inspire. I just want to come to you, Congresswoman Blunt Rochester. I want to, when you were introduced by Lauren, she said, this Congresswoman is on the panel to help, or the committee, to help decide who's going to be Biden's VP. Now, in all transparency, I wanted to be a Black woman, and I have been working with a national network of women of color who want to see a Black woman on the ticket. So just so I'm 100% transparent, that's where I am. But where are you? Do you think that, perhaps you can't, you're talking to deliberations and it's very confidential. Right. Tell me more about this process and your thinking about Black women leadership at the top of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Amy, for asking that question for a couple of reasons. Number one, just to go off of Alana's point, I was looking at the Black census that Black Futures Lab has done, and it showed the participation, at least those in the Black census, that like almost over 70%, almost 75% of Black folks vote and participate in some kind of way. And even the ones who don't still align on the issues with those who do. But one of the other things that is said is that we, even though we have been loyal, don't feel that the system, I'll just say the system, we believe it takes us for granted. We believe, for some people, they feel like, well, maybe it won't make a difference whether I vote or not. And I truly believe this is just like we were talking about a pandemic on top of a pandemic. If we don't do something in November as a country, I'm gonna call that an apocalypse on top of the pandemics, because we have to see change. And so the vice presidential selection piece, I also want to take a step back and say, people thought that because I'm from Delaware and Joe Biden's from Delaware, I'm gonna automatically endorse or support. But I had to have my own conversation, not with my delegation, but me as a Black woman, to ask questions that I had about the crime bill, about Anita Hill, about what kind of staff are you going to hire for the campaign? What kind of staff are you going to hire if you get in? And at that meeting, which was supposed to be 30 minutes, it went 2.5 hours with me talking mostly and also getting answers. That's when he said that his intention, this was right before he announced running, that his intention was to have a woman be the vice president. That was his hope from the very beginning. And there are 4 people that are on this committee to pick. While I can't talk about the specific people, I can tell you my own heart and what goes into it for me. What goes into it for me is we all know we have a lot of qualified Black women that are being considered and that are out there. And I think that, number one, that needs to be stated up front. I respect you and others who are calling for a Black woman vice president, because it's not like it would be a favor. It is really, what people are saying is they also, in addition to voter suppression, there's the issue of voter depression. And then there's the issue of the Russians. And so we want to win, and we want to win big. I accepted the role when he called and asked me, knowing that it would be a historic, but also in ways heavy. People called me and congratulated me, and people called me and said, I feel sorry for you. Everybody's gonna be mad at you, depending on what happens. But I can't live that way. And I don't think Black women live that way. Like I said, we're pragmatic. We want a seat at the table. My middle name is Blunt, and so that's what I am. And I come to this with anything I do. I try to study the issues and know them in depth. I try to make sure that I listen, which is why even the exchange here is so valuable to me, feeds my soul and my brain. And then lastly, I am a person of faith. And so I have this little index card over here on my wall that I typed up. I wrote up, like I do stuff on like paper like this was my New Year's resolution.
Be fully yourself. I saw that, to be fully yourself, which is a big statement. That's a big statement. Less fear, more love.
Exactly, because I feel like this is the moment to speak up, speak out, be fully you. And so on my card over here, it says a lot of things like don't whine and stay prayed up and tomorrow's not promised. But it also says the only one that I need to please is God. That's how I feel. It might be people mad at me, but I'm going to do the doggone thing, and I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. And I'm going to make sure that when we deliberate, that we have people like a Cornel West. I mean, well, Cornel West too is a good one, but Cornel Belcher as a pollster who has a different view of things that can bring to the table. So I'm not scared. I'm humbled. I'm honored. I am going to be blunt. And I recognize the times that we are living in. I recognize the times that we are living in. Ultimately, it's going to be his decision, but I will carry with me Fannie Lou Hamer. I will carry with me Harriet Tubman. I will carry with me my grandmother, Lucille, who was a union leader, and my grandmother, Helen Blunt, who raised 4 kids in the projects in Philly, who was a nurse. I will carry all these people with me, including my 31-year-old daughter, Alyssa, who is a social worker. Both kids went to HBCUs. I will carry all of that with me as I try to help us get the next vice president and ultimately win back the White House.
Wow, thank you. And it's such a heavy and such an important, decision that I think deals with the other, we talked about voter suppression, but Attorney General, I want to talk to you about the other half, which is voter depression. How do we get voters across the board, maybe those who have been protesting, those who are calling for not only police accountability, but the end of white supremacy and racism, which has been so baked into the DNA of this country? How do we deal with depression? How do we change that depression into inspiration? I mean, I think from an attorney general, like there's been a lot of conversation about a system that has even good people go into a system, but Black people still get killed on a regular basis. So how do we get people to the point where they're feeling inspired? And what do you think Black women can do to help with that?
So I view the law as both a sword and a shield. And whenever I talk to young people, I'm pretty honest with them. Change has never come from the top down. It always comes from the bottom up. And that's why they've got to continue to march until we see change. And they've got to listen to Black women and follow Black women. Black women offer a critical perspective that has not received the consideration it deserves. Black women are all too familiar with our nation's shortcomings. I would say our nation's birth defects. And who better to know what needs to be fixed and how it needs to be fixed? And we as a people have tended to think about others before we've thought about ourselves. We are a very loving and inclusive group, and we have this infinite capacity to love and compassion and empathy. And you hear it in the words and the voice of the Congresswoman. And we've got to effectively communicate across all diverse groups and perspectives of America, but we've got to reach young people, and they've got to see your authenticity. Which is why I love marching with them. I love inspiring them. I love raising their hopes. And I love, again, turning this moment into a teaching moment about all of the struggles that we've been through and how we have survived, how we've come on the other side of the mountain and how we've survived, and how there's really something special and innate about our abilities, and that we've got to take this pain that all of us are experiencing and turn it into purpose.
Well,
and so my last point is, what we have is the power of the vote, which is the cornerstone of the civil rights movement, and the power of protest. And not to protest violently, because violence, as we all know, does not achieve any change at all. It's very futile. Thank you.
Well, and thank you. And what I've heard from all of you is the deep connection as Black women leaders between movement and policy, between movement and the vote, that it's all considered part of an expression of way of being in this democracy. I also really appreciate the word love. You don't often hear that in the context of politics. It's something that characterizes the kind of leadership and moral clarity I believe Black women, you know, everyone on this panel and Black women that I work with every day, you know, bring to this. What I wanted to say is we've got a couple of questions and from the audience. And Lauren, I see you popped in with your daughter here. What we need to, you know, let me just start by asking you three. And Nancy posed a really good question, because we started with a call for accountability for the police killing of George Floyd, but it was more than that. It was all the things. And now we're having larger calls for the end of racism. So Nancy asked, since racism is a systemic part of every institution, where do we start? And I'd like you to be specific if you can. Use your couple of top examples. What policies would be a good starting point? Let's start with you, Congresswoman.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for that question, because it's the real deal. It's like, get real. So first of all, the Justice and Policing Act that we just introduced has a lot of specifics in it that will deal with the policing part. It is not everything that needs to be done, but it's real concrete things that can actually make a difference right now on the ground. Secondly, even personally, as a member of Congress, I worked really hard to get on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is one of the toughest committees to get on, because it's where environment and climate change is, which I'm on that subcommittee, and I'm working on environmental justice issues and making sure that communities that are next to toxic waste sites or ports, that the communities are engaged and involved in making sure that they have justice. Healthcare, I have a bill that is to provide treatment for COVID-19 for free. We're talking about paying for testing, but if you know you have it and you can't get treatment, what good is that? Like, there are actual concrete things that we can do that shine a light and that actually do deal with specifics. The funding for our HBCUs, we were able to get money specifically for the HBCU right, across the state, across the country. But I still think I'm sorry, but I really want to go back to that word love, because to me, the real crux of all of this stuff is that this whole country was built on a shaky foundation from the indigenous people who it was taken from, and then from slaves and the folks, us, that came 400 years ago. And all the different institutions, you know, whether it's because of money or power or whatever, it's not coming from a place of love. And so the reason why this is so important in this moment is because, as was said earlier, if it is truly where we are different races, different backgrounds, to see white people holding Black Lives Matter signs, that's like when Barack Obama won Iowa. All of a sudden we're like, whoa, maybe this is possible. Like, you know, and so I want us to not miss this moment and have those uncomfortable conversations. That's what I've been telling people here. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable for a little while, because if we're going to dismantle it in all of these different institutions, it's going to take more than a program. We've tried programs and we haven't seen outcomes. So I think this movement is an opportunity. We can do things legislatively, but we also have to change the hearts and minds of people. And it's one by one.
Amy,
One by one.
Amy, perhaps we can give Tish our last word so that we wrap. It's hard to be
It's so hard. It's so
Lauren, just one
Thank
little
you.
tiny word too.
Yeah. We just have a couple minutes left, and Attorney General, we do want to hear from you. Where do we start? What's concrete thing? That's a good starting point for us here.
We need to talk about the use of force. We need to talk about de-escalation. We need to talk about the burdens of proof when you go to trial involving a police officer. Part of the reason why most police officers are not convicted in this nation is because the burden of proof is too high. We need to ban chokeholds. which is low-hanging fruit as far as I'm concerned, because most police guidelines prohibit chokeholds, but we need to codify it. We need to incentivize federal money and tie it to reform of police departments all across this nation. Individuals talk about defunding the police, but people need to understand it's really about prioritizing our values. And so funds should be given to mental health professionals. Monies should be given to individuals to respond to domestic violence. The police officers are not in a position, obviously, to respond to everything. And so we really need to parcel it out. And we need to underscore the point that poverty and mental illness should not be crimes. We need independent investigations of police shootings, similar to what Keith Ellison is doing, my colleague. And I was the first Attorney General in this nation, or the first person to call that Keith Ellison be appointed to that investigation, and he's doing an excellent job. We need to release police officers' disciplinary records. We need to make sure that body cameras, that the federal government funds body cameras all across this nation, notwithstanding the objections of police unions. And we need to make sure that we do a better job in diversifying our police force by hiring, promoting, and retaining Black and brown and Latino officers of color, and that they need to live in the communities that they profess to patrol. Thank you.
Yeah, there's so much there. And I think just I want to thank you, Attorney General, and I thank you, Congresswoman Alana Odoms, for your wisdom, experience, your brilliance. And, you know, the work of She the People is around creating a country that's governed by love and justice and belonging and democracy. And I'm sure you'll all agree that the women that have joined us this last hour are the best. They're the American patriots and the leaders that we need. Lauren, I just want to thank you for all the work you've done to bring us all together, and I'll turn it over to you. I look forward to continuing the conversation as we take advantage of this moment to show incredible moral courage and to transform into the country we need it to be.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you all so much for this beautiful and powerful conversation. I could listen to you all night. And I'm going to encourage everyone that's been on this session to spread the word. We will share this session out. You can watch it, share it with your friends and family. It's so important that we keep these conversations going, not just now, not just when people are in the streets, but every day for the rest of our lives. So with that, I want to thank everyone for being with us. And a huge thanks to our dear friends, Amy Allison at She the People, Aaron Haynes at the 19th News, all of our speakers, and our friends, especially Mark Updegrove at the LBJ Library, who made this program possible, as well as our sponsors at Mark and Lord Abbott. More of this, please. Thank you all so, so much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank